Security, remove him now. The words didn't echo. They sliced through the bank like a blade, sharp enough to stop conversations mid-sentence and freeze the soft hum of counting machines behind the counter. Every head turned, not because of the volume, but because of the certainty behind it, the kind of certainty that only comes from someone who believes they are right, absolutely right, without question, and standing at the center of it all, unmoved, unshaken, was Malcolm Hayes. He didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't even look surprised. He stood there in a plain charcoal hoodie, dark jeans, and worn white sneakers, the kind you could find at any outlet store for under $100. Nothing about him signaling wealth, nothing about him announcing power, nothing about him asking for attention. And that was exactly the problem, because in a place like this, polished marble floors stretching across a 3,000-square-foot lobby, glass walls reflecting quiet wealth, clients in tailored suits speaking in low, confident tones, appearance wasn't just noticed, it was judged, and Malcolm, at a glance, didn't fit. He had walked in 8 minutes earlier through the revolving doors, alone, no assistant, no briefcase, no branded anything, just a phone in his hand and a presence that didn't try to fill the room, but somehow did anyway. The receptionist had seen him, paused for half a second too long, then looked past him as if someone more important might walk in right behind. He noticed. He always noticed. Malcolm moved toward the line. Except it wasn't really a line. It was more like a silent hierarchy. 2 people ahead of him, both greeted within seconds, both offered coffee, both addressed by name. When Malcolm stepped forward, the teller didn't greet him. She didn't smile. She didn't even look up right away. When she did, it was quick, assessing, already deciding. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. Her tone neutral, but her eyes anything but. Malcolm's voice was calm, level, almost quiet enough to disappear if you weren't listening. "No, I need to make a withdrawal." She blinked, then glanced at his clothes again, the way people do when they're trying to match what they see with what they think they know. "From which account?" Malcolm slid a simple black card across the counter. No logo facing up, no dramatic gesture, just a small, controlled movement. "Run the name," he said. The teller hesitated, not because she couldn't, but because something about him made her uncomfortable, like he was skipping steps in a process she relied on. "I'll need identification first," she replied, her voice a little firmer now, a little louder, enough for the man standing 3 feet away to glance over. Malcolm didn't argue. He reached into his pocket and placed his ID next to the card, the plastic making a soft sound against the marble surface. She picked it up between 2 fingers, scanning it quickly, then slower, then again, like repetition might reveal something hidden. "And the amount?" she asked. "5 million, Malcolm said. The words didn't rise, didn't demand attention, but they landed anyway. Heavy, out of place, like a note played in the wrong key. The man to the right shifted slightly. Someone near the seating area looked up, the teller's lips pressed together. "I'm going to need to verify that," she said, already turning her screen slightly away from him, already creating distance. Malcolm simply nodded. Of course, but verification didn't come the way it should have. Instead, it came with delay, with side glances, with a subtle shift in posture that said this was no longer a transaction. It was a situation. The teller whispered something to the colleague next to her. The colleague looked up, then looked at Malcolm, then leaned closer. A quiet exchange, not meant to be heard, but loud enough to be felt. Malcolm stood still, hands resting loosely at his sides, his expression unchanged, as if time itself had slowed around him. And then the manager appeared. She moved with purpose, heels clicking against marble in sharp, deliberate beats, her posture straight, her smile tight and professional in the way that signals control more than warmth. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't greet him. She positioned herself just slightly above the interaction, as if stepping into a scene that needed correction. "Is there a problem here?" she asked. Not to Malcolm, but to the teller. The teller glanced at Malcolm before answering. "He's requesting a large withdrawal without prior notice." Her voice careful now, measured, building a case. The manager's eyes shifted to Malcolm, scanning him the same way one scans a receipt they expect to find an error on. "Sir, transactions of that size require advanced scheduling," she said. Malcolm met her gaze, calm, steady. "Then schedule it." He replied. There was no edge in his voice, no challenge, just a statement. But something about it unsettled her. Maybe it was the confidence without volume, the certainty without explanation. She crossed her arms slightly, a small movement that closed the space between authority and judgment. We also need to verify the source of funds, she added. Malcolm tilted his head just a fraction. You have my account. You have my ID. Run the name, he repeated. The phrase hung in the air. Simple, direct, almost too simple. A man near the back pulled out his phone, not obviously recording, but not hiding it either. A young employee standing near the side desk watched, her brows pulling together slightly, as if something about this didn't sit right. The manager exhaled slowly, then made her decision. We can't proceed with this request, she said, her voice now carrying across the lobby. You'll need to leave and return with proper documentation. Malcolm didn't move. What documentation? He asked. The manager's tone sharpened. Proof of funds. Verification. Appointment confirmation. This isn't a walk-in service center. A few heads turned more openly now. The air in the room shifted, no longer quiet, no longer neutral. Malcolm's eyes flicked briefly across the lobby, taking in the subtle reactions, the curiosity, the discomfort, the quiet alignment forming in the background. And then it happened. The manager stepped closer, just enough to close the invisible line between instruction and enforcement. Sir, I'm asking you to leave, she said. Malcolm looked at her looked at her, as if measuring not her authority, but her certainty. You're asking me to leave a bank I have an account with, he said. She didn't hesitate. Yes. And then, louder, sharper, cutting through the room with finality. Security, remove him now. The words landed like a verdict. A uniformed guard near the entrance straightened, already moving, already responding to a call that assumed compliance. Malcolm didn't step back. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even turn fully toward the guard. Instead, he exhaled, slow and controlled, the kind of breath that comes not from fear, but from recognition. He had seen this before. Not here, not this building, not this exact moment, but the pattern. At 26, when a loan officer had smiled while denying him despite numbers that outperformed every metric. At 31, when a deal almost collapsed because someone couldn't reconcile his face with his portfolio. The same look, the same pause, the same quiet decision made before facts were even considered. And now, standing in a bank lobby that gleamed with polished confidence, it was happening again. The guard approached, not aggressive, but firm, guided by instruction more than understanding. Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me, he said. Malcolm finally turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge him. Give it a minute, Malcolm replied. The guard hesitated, just for a second. The manager scoffed softly. We're not waiting. But Malcolm's phone was already in his hand. The screen lit up, casting a faint glow against his palm. One tap. No dramatic motion, no announcement, just a single, deliberate action. Somewhere above them, unseen, systems began to wake. Screens that weren't visible to the lobby flickered to life. Logs started recording. Access points opened. And Malcolm stood there, still as stone, as if anchored to the very floor beneath him. The manager folded her arms tighter, mistaking stillness for compliance, mistaking silence for submission. This is exactly the problem, she muttered, not realizing how many people could hear her. The young employee at the side desk took a step forward, then stopped, caught between protocol and instinct. The man with the phone shifted his angle slightly, capturing more of the scene. The room wasn't loud, but it was charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. Malcolm lifted his eyes again, meeting the manager's gaze one last time. His voice, when it came, was quiet, almost calm enough to be mistaken for indifference. You're right about one thing, he said. She frowned, confused by the lack of resistance. This is exactly the problem. A flicker of something crossed her face. Uncertainty, maybe, or the first hint that something wasn't unfolding the way she expected. Malcolm's phone buzzed once. A subtle vibration, barely audible. He glanced at it, then back at her. But not for the reason you think, he added. And in that moment, as the guard paused, as the teller's screen refreshed, as the first ripple of something unseen moved through the system above them, the balance in the room shifted, quietly, almost invisibly. but enough that, if you were paying attention, you could feel it. Something had just started, and none of them, not the manager, not the teller, not the guard, had any idea they had already stepped into it. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured in small, almost invisible ways, like glass under pressure. The teller's screen refreshed again, her fingers hovering above the keyboard as if she suddenly did not trust what she was seeing. The manager shifted her weight, just slightly, but enough to betray the first crack in her certainty. Malcolm Hayes did not move, not a step, not an inch, but something about him had changed, not in posture, not in expression, but in presence, like the room had finally caught up to the gravity he carried. The guard, still standing within arm's reach, glanced at the manager, waiting for confirmation that now felt less solid than it had seconds ago. "Sir," the guard repeated, quieter this time. "I need you to come with me." Malcolm did not look at him, not yet. His eyes were still on the manager, steady, unblinking. "Give it a minute," he said again, calm, controlled, as if time itself belonged to him. The manager let out a short breath, half laugh, half irritation. "We are not waiting for anything," she snapped, her voice rising just enough to reclaim attention. "You have been asked to leave." But her voice no longer carried the same weight. It echoed differently now, thinner, less certain. Behind the counter, the teller's eyes flicked between her screen and Malcolm, then back again, her lips parting slightly as if she was about to say something but did not know how. Numbers had appeared where she did not expect them, flags where there should have been none, layers of access opening that she had never seen before. She clicked once, then again, then froze. The account was not just active, it was massive, structured in a way that only high-level clients had. With internal tags she did not even have clearance to fully interpret. She swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper, "Ma'am." The manager did not turn. She was too focused on maintaining control, on the audience that had formed around them, on the perception that she still held authority over this moment. "Not now," she said sharply. But the teller did not stop looking at the screen. "Ma'am, I think." "I said not now." The manager cut her off, louder this time. And that was the moment the room shifted again, because people were no longer just watching. They were listening. A man near the seating area lowered his newspaper, his eyes narrowing slightly. The young employee by the side desk took another step forward, drawn in by something she could not ignore anymore. The guard adjusted his stance, his certainty now balanced on instructions that suddenly felt incomplete. Malcolm's phone buzzed again. A second vibration, soft but deliberate. He glanced down briefly, just enough to confirm what he already knew. Somewhere above them, the system was no longer waking up. It was fully awake. Internal cameras that had always been there but rarely mattered were now being monitored in real time. Compliance logs were recording every word spoken within the last 60 seconds. And in a quiet office miles away, people who had never set foot in this branch were now watching it unfold second by second. Malcolm lifted his head again, his gaze sweeping the room once, not in arrogance, not in challenge, but in recognition. This was no longer just about him. This was about the pattern. The manager took a step closer, her heels striking the marble with more force now, as if volume could replace certainty. "This is your final warning," she said, each word spaced, deliberate, rehearsed. "Leave the premises or we will escalate this situation." Malcolm's expression did not change. "You already have," he replied. The words landed differently this time, not as defiance, but as truth. The teller finally turned, her face pale, her voice unsteady. "Ma'am, his account." The manager spun toward her, irritation flashing across her face. "What about it?" The teller hesitated, glancing at Malcolm again before speaking. "It is flagged at executive level." The manager blinked, just once, processing. "That does not change procedure," she said quickly, too quickly. "We still require." "It says ownership tier," the teller interrupted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. That word hung in the air, heavy, out of place, impossible to ignore. The man with the phone shifted again, angling closer. The young employee took another step forward, now fully within earshot. The guard's posture changed, subtle but undeniable. He was no longer leading. He was observing. The manager's jaw tightened. "That is not possible," she said. but the certainty was gone. Malcolm finally moved, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just shifting his weight slightly. Enough to signal that the moment had reached something irreversible. Run. It again, he said quietly. The teller did not argue this time. Her fingers moved quickly, pulling up deeper layers, accessing tabs she had never opened before. Each click seemed louder than the last. Her eyes widened. The account was not just executive level. It was linked, layered, tied into something far beyond a single branch. Internal notes appeared, locked fields unlocked. A name repeated in places it should not have been repeated. She looked up, her voice barely steady. It is real. The manager's eyes flicked to Malcolm, then back to the screen, then back again, her mind trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she believed. There must be an error, she said. But now it sounded like a question. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, the faintest shift, the kind that signals the beginning of something, not the end. There is, he said. The room held its breath, not loudly, not dramatically, but collectively. Even the air felt different. The guard took a half step back, not retreating, but creating space. The young employee spoke up for the first time, her voice clear, cutting through the tension. Maybe we should verify with corporate. The manager turned on her instantly, but the reaction lacked force. Stay out of this, she said. But it did not land. Because the room was no longer hers to control, Malcolm's phone buzzed a third time. He did not look at it immediately. He let the moment stretch, just long enough for the weight of it to settle. Then he glanced down, read the message, and slipped the phone back into his hand. His eyes returned to the manager. Calm, steady, final. You asked me to leave, he said. She did not respond. She could not. You assumed I did not belong here, he continued. The words were not loud, but they carried. People leaned in without realizing it. You decided that before you checked anything that mattered. The teller swallowed hard. The young employee looked down. The guard shifted again, his stance now completely neutral. The manager opened her mouth, then closed it. Malcolm took a small breath, not dramatic, not forced, just enough to mark the transition. You called security, he said. His voice did not change, but the room felt it. You made a decision based on what you saw, not what was real. The screen behind the teller flickered again, a subtle change, but enough to draw attention. Internal alerts had begun to appear, not visible to clients, but visible to staff. The teller's eyes widened further. Ma'am, there is an internal review notification. The manager's head snapped toward her. What? It just came through, the teller said, her voice trembling slightly. It says, live audit in progress. The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water. The ripples spread instantly. The man with the phone lowered it slightly, stunned. The young employee stepped back, processing. The guard's eyes moved from the screen to Malcolm, then back again, and Malcolm stood there, exactly where he had been from the beginning, exactly as he had been, calm, composed, unshaken. But now, finally, the room saw him differently. Not because he raised his voice, not because he revealed anything yet, but because the system itself had begun to respond to him. The manager took a step back, just one, but it was enough. Her authority had not been taken. It had dissolved. Malcolm's gaze did not leave her. You said we are not waiting, he said softly. A pause. Now we are. And for the first time since this began, no one in the room disagreed. The room did not move forward. It held itself in place, suspended between what had just happened and what was about to unfold. The phrase live audit did not sound loud, but it carried a weight that no one in that lobby could ignore, especially not the staff who understood what it meant behind the polished counters and controlled smiles. The teller's hands hovered above the keyboard, no longer typing, no longer pretending this was routine, because routine did not come with system-wide alerts and real-time monitoring. Her eyes moved from the screen to the manager, searching for instruction, but the manager no longer had any to give. For the first time since she stepped into the interaction, she was not leading it. She was reacting to it. What does that mean? She asked, her voice lower now, stripped of the sharp edge it carried moments before. The teller swallowed, her throat tightening slightly as she read the notification again, as if hoping it would change. It means corporate is watching, she said quietly. The words settled into the space like a slow realization spreading through everyone present. The man with the phone lowered it completely now, not out of disinterest, but because the situation had moved beyond something to casually record. The young employee stepped closer to the counter, her curiosity now replaced with concern. The guard shifted again, his stance no longer aligned with removal, but with observation, as if he understood instinctively that whatever was happening, it was bigger than his role in it. Malcolm Hayes remained exactly where he had been, centered, grounded, his presence unchanged while everything around him adjusted to it. He did not rush the moment, did not speak over it, did not fill the silence. He let it expand, let it settle, let it reveal what it needed to reveal. Because he had learned long ago that silence, when held correctly, was not absence, it was pressure, and pressure exposed everything. The manager turned back to him. Her expression caught somewhere between confusion and resistance. "You triggered this," she said, but it sounded less like an accusation and more like a question she was trying to answer for herself. Malcolm's eyes did not leave hers. "No," he said calmly. A pause. "You did." The statement did not come with emotion, but it landed harder than anything she had said earlier, because now, there was evidence behind it, visible, undeniable, unfolding in real time. The teller's screen flickered again, another layer opening. Another set of internal tags appearing, one she had only heard about in training but never seen activated. "There are multiple flags now," she said, her voice tightening slightly. "Compliance, executive review, and," she hesitated, then read it aloud. "Protocol escalation." The manager blinked, the words hitting her one by one, each one stripping away another layer of certainty. "That does not apply to this situation," she said quickly, but the speed betrayed her. She was no longer stating policy. She was trying to outrun what was happening. Malcolm tilted his head slightly. The faintest shift again, the kind that signaled understanding more than reaction. "It applies to every situation," he replied. The young employee spoke up again, this time more confidently, her voice cutting through the tension with clarity. "If compliance is involved, we should stop everything until they respond." The manager turned toward her, but the authority behind her gaze had thinned. "We are not shutting down operations because of one customer," she said, but even as she said it, the word customer sounded incomplete, inaccurate, like it no longer fit. The teller shook her head slightly, her eyes still fixed on the screen. "It is not just one customer anymore," she said quietly. "The system has locked this interaction." The phrase locked carried a different kind of weight. It meant no shortcuts, no overrides, no quiet fixes behind the scenes. It meant everything was being recorded, reviewed, preserved. The guard exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing just slightly. As he stepped back another half step, creating more distance between himself and Malcolm, not out of fear, but out of awareness. He was no longer part of an enforcement action. He was standing inside an event. Malcolm's phone buzzed again, a fourth time now, consistent, controlled, like a heartbeat that had found its rhythm. He glanced at it briefly, reading the message, then slipped it back into his hand. Somewhere far from this branch, people were not just watching anymore. They were responding. The manager noticed the glance, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Who are you talking to?" she asked, her voice quieter now, more measured. Malcolm did not answer immediately. He let the question sit, let it exist in the same space as everything else that had already shifted. Then he said, simply, "The people you should have called first." The words did not rise, but they carried. The teller's screen updated again, a new notification appearing at the top, bold, unmistakable. She read it, silently at first, then her eyes widened further. "Ma'am." The manager turned sharply, tension snapping back into her posture. "What now?" The teller hesitated, then read it aloud. Each word clear, precise, impossible to soften. "All staff involved in current interaction are to remain in place pending executive review." The air in the lobby changed again, not dramatically, but definitively. Remain in place. No one was leaving now, not Malcolm, not the manager, not the teller, not even the guard. The situation had closed in on itself, contained, controlled, observed. The man with the phone glanced around, then back at Malcolm, his expression shifting from curiosity to realization. The young employee took a small step back, processing the weight of what she was hearing. The manager stood still, completely still now, her earlier movement replaced by a kind of rigid awareness. "This is excessive," she said. But the words lacked conviction. Malcolm's gaze remained steady. "No," he said. A pause. "This is accurate." The teller's hands finally dropped from the keyboard, resting against the edge of the counter as if she no longer trusted herself to touch anything else. "There is more," she said, her voice barely steady. "It says all prior actions in this interaction are being reviewed for compliance violations." That word, violations, landed differently than anything else so far. It did not suggest confusion. It suggested consequence. The manager's lips parted slightly, then pressed together again. Her mind was moving fast now, retracing steps, replaying words, calculating exposure. Malcolm watched her, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with clarity, because this was the moment he had been waiting for. Not the reveal, not the reaction, but the realization. The moment when someone understood that the situation they thought they controlled had already moved beyond them. The guard glanced at Malcolm again, then at the manager, then back at the teller's screen, his role now fully secondary to what was unfolding. The young employee spoke again, softer this time, almost to herself but loud enough to be heard. "This is not normal." Malcolm heard it. Of course he did. He turned his head slightly in her direction, acknowledging her without fully shifting his focus. "No," he said quietly. "It is not." And then, after a brief pause, his eyes returning to the manager, he added, "But it is necessary." The words settled into the room, with a finality that did not need volume. The system above them continued to move, unseen but undeniable, and for the first time since this began, the power in the room was no longer assumed, it was defined, and Malcolm Hayes, still standing in the same spot where he had been told he did not belong, had not raised his voice, had not taken a step, had not demanded anything. He had simply let the truth arrive, one layer at a time, until there was nothing left in the room that could pretend not to see it. The word violations did not echo, but it stayed, suspended in the air like a weight no one could shift, no one could ignore, and for a moment, the entire branch felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to witness what was unfolding. The manager stood frozen, her posture still upright, but no longer firm. Her authority now something she was trying to hold together rather than something she naturally carried. She glanced around the lobby, at the customers who were no longer pretending not to watch, at the staff who were no longer looking to her for direction, but to the screens in front of them for answers, and then back at Malcolm Hayes, who had not moved, not once, not even as the entire structure of the moment shifted around him. "This is unnecessary," she said finally, her voice lower, controlled, but no longer sharp. It sounded like a statement she was trying to convince herself of. Malcolm did not respond immediately. He let the silence answer first, because silence, in this moment, was no longer empty. It was full of everything she had already done. The teller cleared her throat slightly, her eyes scanning a new line that had appeared on her screen. "There is an incoming call," she said, her voice careful, almost hesitant. The manager turned sharply. "From who?" The teller swallowed. "Executive compliance line." The words landed with a finality that could not be softened. The young employee near the side desk took a slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling as she processed the escalation. The guard shifted again, his stance now completely neutral, hands resting at his sides, no longer prepared to act, only to witness. The manager hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. "Put it through," she said, but the command lacked the force it once had. The teller pressed a button, and a small speaker near the counter came to life with a soft tone, followed by a voice that did not raise itself, did not demand attention, but commanded it anyway. "This is corporate compliance," the voice said, calm, precise, unhurried. "We are monitoring a live audit at your location." The entire room stilled again, not because the voice was loud, but because it was final. There was no room for interpretation, no room for dismissal. The manager straightened, slightly, instinctively trying to reclaim some control. "Yes, we are aware," she replied, her tone attempting professionalism, attempting composure. We are handling the situation. There was a brief pause on the line, not long, but long enough to feel deliberate. No, the voice said, evenly. You are not. The words landed clean, without aggression, without hesitation, and somehow that made them heavier. The manager's lips parted slightly, then closed again. For the first time, she did not have an immediate response. The teller's eyes flicked toward Malcolm, then back to the speaker, her hand still resting against the counter as if she did not trust herself to move. The voice continued. We have reviewed the last 4 minutes of recorded interaction. Another pause. We will now ask a series of questions. The manager nodded automatically, even though the person on the other end could not see her. Of course, she said. The words sounded smaller than it should have. Did the client present valid identification? The voice asked. The manager hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. Yes, she said. Did the client provide account credentials? Yes. Did the client request a transaction within their account limits? The manager's eyes flicked toward the teller, who gave a small, almost invisible nod. Yes, the manager said again. The voice on the line did not change, did not react, did not judge. It simply continued. Then explain why service was denied. The question did not rise in volume, but it filled the room. It removed every distraction, every excuse, every layer of assumption, and left only the truth. The manager opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her mind moved quickly, searching for language that could justify what had already been seen, already been recorded. We were following protocol, she said finally, her voice tighter now. The transaction was large and required verification. Another pause, longer this time. Verification was completed. The voice replied, not a question, not a suggestion, but a statement. The manager's shoulders tightened slightly. We also had concerns about. She stopped herself, the words catching before they could form fully, because anything she said next would have to exist inside the record that was already being built. Malcolm watched her, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with clarity. This was the moment where explanation met evidence. The teller spoke up softly, almost involuntarily. The account is fully verified. The manager shot her a quick look, but it lacked the authority to silence her. The voice on the line continued. Did any staff member use language that could be interpreted as exclusionary or biased? The question hung in the air, sharper than the others. Because it did not ask about process, it asked about intent. The manager's jaw tightened. No, she said quickly. But the words sounded thinner than the truth it was trying to cover. The man near the seating area shifted again, his expression tightening slightly as he replayed what he had heard moments earlier. The young employee lowered her gaze briefly, then lifted it again, as if deciding whether to speak. Malcolm remained still, his presence unchanged, his silence now carrying more weight than any response could. The voice on the line did not react immediately. It waited just long enough to let the answer settle. Then it said, "We have audio." The room did not move. It did not need to. Everything had already been said. The manager's breath caught slightly, just enough to be noticed. The teller looked down at the counter, her fingers pressing lightly against the surface. The guard exhaled slowly, his eyes shifting toward Malcolm again. The young employee took a small step forward, her voice quiet but clear. "There were comments made," she said. The manager turned toward her, but the reaction came too late. The words were already in the air. The voice on the line responded, still calm, still precise. "Please specify." The young employee swallowed, then spoke again, her voice steadying as she did. "There were assumptions about the client not belonging here." The manager closed her eyes briefly, just for a second, then opened them again. The moment she had been trying to control had moved completely beyond her. Malcolm's gaze shifted, slightly, acknowledging the young employee without turning fully toward her, because this was not about him defending himself anymore. It was about the truth stepping forward on its own. The voice on the line continued. "We are now escalating this review to executive level." Another pause. "All involved staff are to remain in position until further instruction." The words were not new, but hearing them again, directly, made them final. The manager's shoulders lowered slightly, the tension no longer something she could direct, only something she had to carry. Malcolm finally took a small step forward, Just one, closing the distance between himself and the counter by less than a foot, but enough to mark a shift. The room noticed. Everyone noticed. He placed his hand lightly on the edge of the marble, not gripping it, not leaning on it, just resting there. His voice, when it came, was calm, steady, unmistakable. "You asked for proof," he said. The manager looked at him, her expression no longer defensive, no longer certain, just aware. "You had it," he continued. A pause. "You chose not to see it." The words did not accuse, they clarified. And in that clarification, there was no space left for misunderstanding. The teller's screen flickered again, a new notification appearing, one she had never seen before. Her eyes widened slightly as she read it. "Ma'am," she said softly. The manager did not respond right away. She was still looking at Malcolm, still processing the shift that had already happened. "There is a new directive," the teller added. The manager turned slowly. "What is it?" The teller hesitated, then read it aloud, each word landing with quiet precision. "Prepare for executive presence on site." The room did not erupt, did not react loudly, but the impact was immediate. Executive presence meant one thing. This was no longer contained, no longer local, no longer something that could be explained away or corrected quietly. Malcolm straightened slightly, his hand lifting from the counter, his posture returning to stillness. He did not smile, did not react outwardly at all. Because for him, this was not a surprise. It was the continuation of something that had already been set in motion. The manager took a slow breath, her eyes moving from the screen, to the teller, to the young employee, to the guard, and finally back to Malcolm. The room was no longer asking what was happening. It knew, and Malcolm Hayes, still dressed in the same simple hoodie and worn sneakers, still standing in the same place where he had been told to leave, had not raised his voice, had not argued, had not demanded anything. He had simply allowed the system, the truth, and the weight of his presence to do what they were always going to do, reveal everything. Executive presence on site did not sound like a threat. It sounded like a clock starting, quiet but irreversible. And the moment those words settled into the air, the entire branch shifted again, not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally, where decisions are made before they are spoken. The manager did not move right away. She stood there absorbing it, her posture still upright, but no longer commanding. Her authority, now something she had to hold on to instead of something that naturally followed her. Her eyes moved across the room again. But this time she was not scanning for control. She was searching for something to anchor to, something that still made sense. The teller did not return to her keyboard, her hands still resting on the counter, as if touching anything else might trigger another layer she was not ready to face. The young employee stood quietly, no longer hesitant, but aware that what she had said had already placed her inside the truth of the moment. The guard remained where he was, but his stance had softened completely, no longer aligned with instruction, only with presence. And Malcolm Hayes, still in the same position, still calm, still composed, stood as if none of this was surprising, because for him, it was not. He had seen systems resist before they revealed themselves. He had seen people hold on to assumptions until they could not. And he had learned that the most powerful shift does not come from force, it comes from clarity. The manager finally spoke, her voice lower now, measured, careful. "How long until they arrive?" The teller glanced at the screen again, reading silently before answering. "It does not say," she replied. A pause. "It just says immediate." That word immediate did not mean seconds. It did not mean minutes. It meant something else entirely. It meant now was already too late to change anything that had already happened. The manager exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just slightly as the weight of that realization settled in. She turned back toward Malcolm, her expression no longer sharp, no longer dismissive, but searching. "If there has been a misunderstanding," she began, her tone shifting toward something closer to resolution, "we can correct it." The words sounded practiced, familiar, the kind of response designed to restore order after a disruption. But in this moment, they did not land the same way. Because this was not a misunderstanding, Malcolm's eyes remained steady on hers. "You already made a correction," he said quietly. A pause. "Just not the one you intended." The manager blinked, the meaning settling in slowly. The room remained still, listening, Not because they were told to, but because they could not look away. The teller glanced at Malcolm again, then back to the screen, then down at her hands. She had processed thousands of transactions, followed countless procedures, but she had never been inside something like this, where the system itself seemed to respond to a person rather than the other way around. The young employee shifted her weight slightly, her voice soft but clear as she spoke again. What happens when executive arrives? The question was not directed at anyone specific, but it filled the room anyway. The manager did not answer immediately, because she knew the answer, and that was exactly why she hesitated. Malcolm turned his head slightly, acknowledging the question, without fully turning away from the center of the moment. They review everything, he said. His voice remained calm, controlled, but there was something else in it now, something deeper, something that carried experience. Not just what you did, he continued. A pause. But why you did it. The words settled into the room with a weight that was impossible to ignore. The manager's eyes dropped for a fraction of a second, then lifted again. She understood now that this was no longer about against the counter. She was no longer processing a transaction. She was witnessing something unfold that would not be undone. The young employee looked between Malcolm and the manager, her expression now fully aware of the shift that had taken place. The guard exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing just enough to signal that whatever role he had been called to perform was no longer needed. And then, without warning, the main entrance doors opened. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to draw attention. The room turned, almost as one. Two individuals stepped inside, both dressed in dark, tailored suits, their presence not announced, not exaggerated, but unmistakable. They did not rush, did not scan the room with urgency. They simply walked forward with the kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly why they are there. The teller's breath caught slightly. The young employee straightened instinctively. The guard stepped aside without being told. The manager did not move. She could not, because she understood, before a word was spoken, that this was the moment everything she had said, everything she had done, would be seen exactly as it was. Malcolm did not turn immediately. He let them approach, let their presence settle into the room the same way as had, without force, without demand, just certainty. One of them spoke, his voice even, professional, precise. We are here for the audit. No introduction, no explanation, because none was needed. The room had already been prepared for this. The manager finally found her voice, though it was no longer the same. We were just reviewing the situation, she said. But even as she spoke, it sounded incomplete. The second executive looked at her briefly, then shifted his gaze to Malcolm, and in that brief moment, something passed between them, not recognition in the obvious sense, but understanding. Because Malcolm Hayes had not needed to raise his voice, had not needed to declare anything yet. The system, the process, the response, it had all already spoken for him. And now, with executive presence standing just a few feet away, the room was no longer waiting for something to happen. It was waiting for the truth to be acknowledged. The air did not shift when the executives arrived. It settled, like a final piece locking into place. And for the first time since this began, the room felt complete. Every role present, every layer exposed. The two men moved with quiet precision, not rushing, not scanning for approval, but walking directly into the center of what had already been set in motion. One of them carried a slim tablet, the other nothing at all, as if everything they needed was already in the system, already in front of them. They stopped a few feet from the counter, close enough to see every expression clearly, far enough to observe without interruption. The first executive spoke again, his voice calm, controlled, leaving no space for interpretation. Who initiated the service denial? The question did not search, it pointed. The manager inhaled slowly, her posture tightening instinctively, as if she could still gather some form of control. I did, she said. The words came out measured, but they carried the weight of everything that had already been recorded. The executive nodded once, not in approval, not in acknowledgement, but as if confirming something already known. On what basis? He asked. The manager hesitated, just long enough for the room to feel it. The transaction was unusually large and required additional verification, she replied. Her voice was steadier now. but it sounded rehearsed, as if she was leaning on policy to hold up something that had already begun to collapse. The second executive glanced at the tablet briefly, then back up. Verification was completed prior to denial, he said. Not a question, not a challenge, just a fact. The manager's eyes flickered toward the teller, then back again. There were concerns about protocol, she added. But the word concerns no longer had the strength it once did. Malcolm Hayes remained silent, his presence unchanged, his eyes steady, watching not for reaction, but for truth to surface. The first executive shifted his attention to the teller. Did you confirm account status? The teller nodded quickly, her voice quieter than before, but clear. Yes, it is fully verified and flagged at executive level. The executive held her gaze for a moment, then nodded slightly, as if marking the statement in place. He turned back to the manager, then explained the deviation. The word deviation landed heavier than any accusation could have. It framed the situation not as a misunderstanding, but as a departure from standard practice. The manager's lips pressed together briefly. We were exercising caution, she said. The room absorbed the words, but they did not hold, because caution did not explain tone, did not explain assumptions, did not explain the call for security. The second executive stepped forward half a step, his voice even, precise. Caution does not override verified access. A pause. And it does not justify escalation without cause. The manager's shoulders lowered slightly, the resistance fading not because she chose to let it go, but because there was nothing left to hold on to. The young employee shifted closer to the counter, her eyes moving between the executives and Malcolm, her earlier uncertainty now replaced with clarity. The guard remained still, his role fully dissolved into the background. The first executive turned slightly, his gaze settling on Malcolm for the first time in a direct, intentional way. There was no surprise in his expression, no confusion, only recognition of presence. Sir, he said, his tone respectful but measured. We apologize for the disruption. The words were formal, but they carried weight because of when they were spoken, not how. Malcolm inclined his head slightly, not accepting, not rejecting, simply acknowledging. He did not speak yet, because this was not the moment for explanation. It was the moment for everything to be seen clearly. The second executive looked back at the tablet, scrolling once, then stopping. We have reviewed the audio, he said. The room did not move. There were statements made that indicate bias in service judgment. The words did not rise, did not accuse. But they defined. The manager closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. The realization now complete. This was no longer about defending a decision. It was about facing what that decision revealed. The teller's hands tightened slightly against the counter. The young employee stood still, her earlier words now part of something larger. The guard looked toward the floor for a moment, then back up. The first executive spoke again. This branch is currently under full compliance review. Effective immediately. The phrase landed with quiet finality. It did not create noise, it created consequence. The manager took a small breath, her voice lower now, stripped of everything it had carried before. Understood, she said. And in that single word, the shift was complete. Malcolm finally moved, just slightly, straightening his posture, his presence now not just steady, but defined. He stepped forward one pace, closing the remaining distance between himself and the counter. The room followed the movement without realizing it. His voice, when it came, was calm, even, but carried a weight that no one could ignore. You said I did not belong here, he said. The manager looked at him, her expression no longer defensive, only aware. You made that decision before you checked anything that mattered. A pause. That is not protocol. The words were simple, but they cut through everything else, because they named the truth directly. The first executive watched him, not interrupting, not stepping in, because this was not his moment to control, it was Malcolm's moment to define. The teller's screen flickered again, another update appearing, this time larger, more visible. Her eyes widened as she read it. There is a directive from the board, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The second executive glanced at the tablet, then nodded once. Display it, he said. The teller hesitated, then pressed a key. The main screen behind the counter shifted, the standard interface replaced by a clean, Simple message. All operations paused for executive review. The room went still again. But this time it was different. It was not tension. It was acknowledgement. The manager looked at the screen, then back at Malcolm, the final piece falling into place. Because this was not just a client standing in front of her. This was someone the system itself responded to. Someone whose presence had already reached beyond this branch. Beyond her authority. Beyond everything she thought she controlled. Malcolm's gaze did not waver. "You did not see me," he said quietly. A pause. "You saw what you expected." The words settled into the room, not as accusation, but as truth. The young employee lowered her gaze briefly, then lifted it again. The guard remained still, his expression neutral but thoughtful. The teller stood frozen, her hands no longer moving, her role now entirely secondary to what had already unfolded. The executives said nothing for a moment, allowing the weight of it to remain. Because sometimes, the most important part of a moment is not what is added, but what is finally understood. And Malcolm Hayes, standing in the same place where he had been told to leave, had not raised his voice, had not forced anything, had not revealed everything yet. But the system had already spoken, the truth had already surfaced, and the room, every person in it, now stood inside. That truth with nowhere left to look, but directly at it. The words settled, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a finality that no one in the room could escape. And for a moment, no one moved. Not because they were told to stay still, but because there was nowhere left to go inside the truth that had just been laid bare. The screen behind the counter still displayed the directive. Operations paused, executive review in progress. A message that did not flash or demand attention, but commanded it anyway. The manager stood there, her shoulders no longer squared with authority, her posture now shaped by realization, her eyes fixed on Malcolm Hayes as if seeing him clearly for the first time, not as a disruption, not as a problem, but as the center of everything that had just unfolded. The executives remained composed, their presence steady, their silence intentional, because they understood that this moment did not need to be rushed, it needed to be understood. The teller shifted slightly, her hands lifting from the counter only to rest. Again, unsure of what role she now played in a situation that had moved far beyond transactions and procedures, the young employee stood quietly, her earlier words now echoing in the space. Not loudly, but enough to remind everyone that the truth had not come from one place. It had surfaced from multiple directions at once. The guard remained near the entrance, no longer part of any instruction, only a witness to something that had redefined the space he was used to protecting. Malcolm did not rush to fill the silence. He let it stretch, let it settle, because he knew that in moments like this, what people remember is not how loud something was, but how clear it became. He looked at the manager, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a calm that carried weight. "You said this was about protocol," he said, his voice even, steady, each word placed carefully. The manager swallowed, her eyes not leaving his. She did not respond, not because she refused, but because she no longer had anything that could stand against what had already been shown. Malcolm continued. "Protocol exists to protect the process." A pause, just enough for the words to land, not to replace judgment. The phrase settled into the room. Simple, direct, undeniable. The first executive glanced briefly at his colleague, then back at Malcolm, not interrupting, not correcting, because there was nothing to correct. The teller's screen flickered again, another update appearing, and this time she did not hesitate to read it. "Full behavioral review initiated," she said quietly. The words carried a different kind of weight, not tied to accounts or transactions, but to actions, to decisions, to patterns. The manager's gaze dropped for a fraction of a second, then lifted again, her expression no longer searching for control, only trying to understand the extent of what had been triggered. The young employee took a small breath, her shoulders rising and falling slowly as she processed the shift from a single moment to something much larger. Malcolm's eyes moved briefly across the room, taking in each person, not as individuals to confront, but as parts of a system that had just revealed itself. "This is not about one transaction," he said. The words were quiet, but they carried. "Never was." The second executive nodded almost imperceptibly, as if confirming something already understood. The manager's voice came, softer now, stripped of the sharp edges it had carried before. "Then what is it about?" she asked. The question was no longer defensive, no longer dismissive. It was genuine, and that made it heavier. Malcolm held her gaze, steady, unflinching. "It is about what happens before you check the facts," he said. A pause. "It is about the decision you make in the first 5 seconds, before the system even has a chance to respond." The room absorbed the words in silence. The teller looked down at the counter again, her fingers pressing lightly against the surface as if grounding herself. The young employee's expression shifted, understanding deepening. The guard remained still, his presence now almost invisible against the weight of the moment. The first executive stepped forward slightly, his voice calm, measured. "We will now proceed with individual statements," he said. The structure of the situation tightened again, not with tension, but with process. He looked at the manager first. "You will begin." The manager nodded slowly, her composure returning in a different form, not as authority, but as acceptance. She took a breath, then spoke, her voice steady but quieter than before. "I assessed the situation based on appearance and context," she said. The words came carefully, deliberately, as if each one had to pass through the reality of what had already been recorded. "I believed additional caution was necessary." She paused, then added, "I acted before completing full verification." The admission did not rise, did not collapse. It simply existed, clear and undeniable. The teller shifted slightly, her turn approaching, her mind already replaying the moment from her perspective. The young employee looked at the manager, then at Malcolm, then back again, seeing now how quickly a single assumption had expanded into something far larger. Malcolm listened, not interrupting, not reacting outwardly, because this was not about hearing something new. It was about hearing it said aloud. The second executive made a brief note on the tablet, then looked at the teller. "Your statement," he said. The teller nodded, her voice softer but steady. "I processed the account and confirmed its status," she said. "I hesitated to proceed because of uncertainty introduced during the interaction." She paused, then added, "I did not challenge the decision when I should have." The words settled into the room with quiet weight. The young employee straightened slightly, her turn now unavoidable. "Your statement," the first executive said, turning to her. She took a breath, then spoke, her voice clear. "I observed the interaction and recognized that assumptions were being made," she said. "I did not intervene immediately." A pause. "I spoke only after escalation had already occurred." Malcolm's gaze shifted slightly toward her, acknowledging the courage it took to say that, not as approval, but as recognition. The guard was next, though no one had called on him yet. He stepped forward slightly, his voice calm. "I responded to a call for removal," he said. "I did not question the basis of the request." He paused, then added, "I deferred to authority without verifying context." The room held those words differently. Because they were not defensive, they were reflective. The executives listened, not interrupting, not correcting, allowing each statement to stand on its own. Malcolm remained still, his presence unchanged, but the weight of the moment now centered not just on what had been done, but on what had been acknowledged. The first executive looked back at the tablet, then up again. "These statements will be entered into the compliance record," he said. The words did not threaten, they defined. The manager nodded once, her acceptance now complete. Malcolm took a small breath, his posture steady, his voice calm as he spoke again. "You all followed a process," he said. A pause, just not the right one. The words did not accuse, they clarified. The teller closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. The young employee looked down, then back up. The guard remained still, absorbing the statement. The executive said nothing for a moment, allowing the truth of it to settle fully. Because in this room, at this moment, there was no longer a question of what had happened. There was only the understanding of why. And Malcolm Hayes, still standing in the same place where he had been told he did not belong, had not raised his voice, had not forced the outcome, had not even revealed everything yet. But he had done something far more powerful. He had made the system show itself. And now, there was no one left in the room who could pretend they had not seen it. The room did not exhale after the statements were made. It held the weight of them. Every word spoken now part of something permanent, something that would not fade when the moment ended. The executive stood still for a beat longer than expected, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, allowing the silence to do what it was meant to do, to settle the truth deeper than any instruction could. The screen behind the counter still displayed the operational pause, the clean message now feeling less like a system directive and more like a reflection of what had already happened inside the room. Malcolm Hayes did not move, his posture unchanged, but there was a shift in his presence, not in strength, but in depth, like the moment had reached a layer beyond observation and entered something more personal. His eyes lowered slightly, not to the floor, but somewhere inward, somewhere memory lived. And for the first time since he stepped into the branch, the room was not the only place he was standing. He was somewhere else too. 16 years earlier, a different building, smaller, less polished, but carrying the same quiet judgment in its walls. He had walked in then with a folder in his hand, numbers prepared, projections printed, every detail aligned, every calculation precise. He had waited in a chair that was too low, across from a desk that felt too high, watching someone read through his work. With an expression that never quite reached belief. "You are not ready for this level," they had said, not loudly, not cruelly, just firmly, as if stating something obvious. He had nodded then, not because he agreed, but because he understood, not the words, but the pattern behind them. Back in the present, the same pattern had just played out again, different building, different people, same decision made before the facts. Malcolm's eyes lifted slowly, returning fully to the room, to the people standing in it, to the system that had just revealed itself. The manager watched him, her expression shifting as if she sensed something in that silence, something beyond the words that had already been spoken. The teller remained still, her attention no longer on the screen, but on Malcolm, as if understanding now that the moment was not just procedural, it was personal. The young employee stood quietly, her earlier clarity now deepening into awareness. The guard remained in place, his presence steady but unobtrusive. The first executive finally spoke, his voice calm, measured, but carrying a new tone, not just procedural, but reflective. "Before we proceed further," he said, "we will allow the client to provide context if he chooses." The words shifted the focus, not away from the system, but toward the person it had just exposed itself against. All eyes moved, not sharply, not dramatically, but collectively, toward Malcolm. He did not respond immediately. He let the space exist for a moment longer, as if deciding not whether to speak, but how much of the truth this room was ready to hear. Then he stepped forward, just one small step, closing the distance in a way that did not feel aggressive, but intentional. His voice, when it came, was calm, even, but carried something deeper now, something layered with time. "This is not the first time," he said. The words were simple, but they shifted the room again, because they connected this moment to something larger, something longer. The manager's eyes lowered briefly, then lifted again. The teller's breath caught slightly. The young employee leaned forward just a fraction. Malcolm continued. "It never starts with policy." A pause. "It starts with perception." The phrase settled into the space, quiet but precise. "You see someone," he said, his gaze moving across the room, not accusing, but acknowledging, "and you decide what they are before they say a word." The words did not rise, but they reached every corner of the room. The guard shifted his stance slightly, absorbing it. The executives remained still, listening without interruption. Malcolm's voice remained steady, controlled, but each word carried more weight than the last. "Then you look for reasons to support that decision," he continued. "Not the truth, just enough to feel right." The manager's shoulders lowered slightly, the truth of that statement landing without resistance. Now, the teller looked down again, her fingers pressing lightly against the counter. The young employee's expression tightened, not in discomfort, but in recognition. Malcolm paused, not for effect, but because the moment required it. Then he said, "And by the time the system catches up, the damage is already done." The words did not accuse, they defined. The first executive nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the clarity being offered. The second executive made a brief note on the tablet, then looked up again. Malcolm's gaze returned to the manager, steady, direct. "You did not deny a transaction," he said. A pause. "You denied a person." The room did not move. It did not need to. Everything had already shifted. The manager's eyes closed briefly, then opened again, her expression no longer defensive, no longer searching, just present. The teller's shoulders lowered slightly. The young employee stood still, her understanding now complete. The guard remained quiet, his role fully transformed from action to witness. The executives allowed the silence to hold again, because this was not a moment to interrupt, it was a moment to absorb. Malcolm took a small breath, his posture steady, his presence grounded. And the system, he continued, is not designed to fix that in real time. A pause. It only reveals it after the fact. The words settled deeper than anything before them, because they explained not just what had happened, but why it mattered. The first executive finally spoke again, his voice calm, measured. "And now it has been revealed." Malcolm nodded once, not in satisfaction, but in acknowledgement. "Yes," he said. The teller's screen flickered again, another update appearing, but this time no one rushed to read it. Because the most important part of the moment was no longer on the screen, it was in the room. The manager looked at Malcolm, her voice quieter than it had ever been. "What would you have expected instead?" she asked. The question was not defensive, not rhetorical. It was real. Malcolm held her gaze, his expression unchanged, but his voice carried something firm, something clear. "The same process," he said. A pause, without the assumption. The words were simple, but they carried everything. The teller nodded faintly, almost involuntarily. The young employee's shoulders eased slightly. The guard exhaled slowly. The executives stood still, allowing the clarity of it to settle fully. Because in that moment, the solution was not complicated, it was not hidden, it had always been there. And Malcolm Hayes, standing in the same place where he had been told he did not belong, had not needed to prove his power, had not needed to reveal his position yet. He had done something far more precise. He had shown exactly where the system broke, and exactly how it could have held. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore. It felt structured, like something had been built in the space between words, something that could not be undone now that it existed. The manager stood still, her question still hanging in the air, but no longer unanswered, because the answer had already been given, not just in words, but in everything that had unfolded. The teller's screen flickered again, a soft shift of light that pulled her attention back, and this time she leaned forward without hesitation, reading carefully, her expression tightening slightly as she processed what appeared. "There is a priority channel open," she said, her voice low but steady. The first executive glanced at his colleague, then back at the teller. "Display it," he said. The screen behind the counter changed again, the previous directive fading into a new interface, cleaner, more direct. A single line of text appearing at the center, "Executive authorization required." The room did not react loudly, but the meaning settled immediately. This was the next step, the point where observation became action. The manager's eyes moved from the screen to the executives, then to Malcolm, her expression no longer searching, but waiting. The second executive stepped forward slightly, his gaze steady. "We will now confirm authorization," he said. The process tightened, not with tension, but with precision. The teller's hands hovered again, ready but still. The young employee leaned in just enough to see the screen clearly. The guard remained near the entrance, still, observant, part of the room, but no longer part of the event. Malcolm Hayes did not move. He stood exactly where he had been, his presence unchanged, but the weight of the moment now centered around him in a way that could not be ignored. The first executive turned toward him, his tone respectful, measured. "Sir, we will need executive confirmation to proceed with full action." The words were formal, but they carried a recognition that had not been spoken directly yet. The room felt it. The manager felt it most of all. Malcolm held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once, a small, controlled motion that carried more authority than any raised voice could. He reached into his pocket slowly, not for effect, not to draw attention, but because it was simply the next step. His phone appeared in his hand again, the same device he had used earlier, the same quiet tool that had already set everything in motion. He unlocked it with a single motion, his eyes scanning briefly, then stopping. The teller watched, her breath held without realizing it. The young employee leaned forward slightly more. The executives remained still, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. Malcolm tapped the screen once, then again, and then he turned the phone slightly, just enough for the first executive to see. The man's expression did not change dramatically, but there was a shift, subtle, unmistakable, recognition, confirmation. He nodded once, then stepped back half a step. Authorization confirmed, he said. The words did not rise, but they landed with finality. The screen behind the counter updated instantly, the interface changing again, new lines appearing, clear, structured, irreversible. The teller read them aloud, her voice steady but carrying the weight of what she was saying. Full branch audit authorized, she began. A pause. Immediate personnel review initiated. Another pause. Operational control transferred to executive oversight. Each line settled. Deeper than the last. The manager's shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in acceptance, because this was no longer a moment she could influence. It was a process she had already entered. The young employee stood still, her eyes fixed on the screen. The guard exhaled slowly, his posture relaxed but attentive. The executives remained composed, their roles now fully active. Malcolm lowered his phone, slipping it back into his pocket with the same calm precision he had shown. From the beginning, he did not speak immediately. He let the system speak first, let the actions define themselves. The first executive turned toward the manager, his voice calm, direct. "You are being placed under formal review effective immediately," he said. The words were not harsh, not raised, but they carried consequence. The manager nodded once, her voice quiet. Understood. There was no resistance left, only acknowledgement. The second executive turned to the teller. "Continue logging all actions," he instructed. She nodded quickly, her fingers moving now with clarity, not hesitation. The young employee stepped back slightly, giving space to the process that was now fully underway. Malcolm's gaze moved across the room once more, not lingering on any one person, but taking in the entirety of what had just been set into motion. This was the point where everything shifted from moment to outcome, from exposure to consequence. The first executive looked back at him, his tone respectful. "We will proceed from here," he said. Malcolm inclined his head slightly, acknowledging without needing to say more. Because this was never about control, it was about correction. The screen continued to update, lines of action appearing one after another, each one precise, each one recorded. The manager stood still, her earlier authority now replaced by accountability. The teller worked steadily, her earlier hesitation gone. The young employee watched, her understanding now complete. The guard remained present, a quiet witness to the transformation of the space. And Malcolm Hayes, still standing in the same place where he had first been told he did not belong, had now become the center of a process that had moved beyond words, beyond assumptions, beyond everything that had started it. He had not raised his voice, had not demanded recognition, had not forced the outcome. He had simply allowed the system to reveal itself. And then, when the moment came, he had confirmed what it already knew. And now, as the branch shifted around him, as roles changed, as actions took form, the truth was no longer something that needed to be argued. It was something that had already taken control. The transition from authorization to consequence did not create noise. It created order, the kind of order that moves quietly but leaves nothing unchanged. And as the system continued to update behind the counter, each new line appearing with precise intent, the room began to feel less like a place of service and more like a place of reckoning. The executives moved with calm efficiency, not rushing, not reacting emotionally, but executing a process that had already been decided the moment the truth was confirmed. The first executive turned slightly toward the manager, his voice even, controlled, leaving no room for interpretation, effective immediately. "You are relieved of decision-making authority pending the outcome of this review," he said. The words did not rise, did not accuse, but they carried a weight that was absolute. The manager nodded once, her shoulders lowering fully now, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement of a boundary she no longer held. She stepped back from the counter, not dramatically, not reluctantly, just enough to signal that her role had shifted. The teller glanced at her briefly, then returned her focus to the screen, her hands moving with new clarity, logging actions, confirming entries, following a process that now felt aligned instead of uncertain. The young employee stepped slightly to the side, giving space, but her eyes remained fixed on everything unfolding, absorbing each moment with a clarity that would not fade. The guard remained near the entrance, his posture relaxed, no longer anticipating instruction, only observing the completion of something that had already begun. Malcolm Hayes stood still, his presence unchanged. But now the room had fully adjusted around him, not because he demanded it, but because it had no other choice. The second executive moved closer to the counter, his eyes scanning the updated system interface, confirming each step with quiet precision. "Personnel review protocol is active," he said, his voice low but clear. "All involved staff will remain on site until further instruction." The teller nodded quickly, her fingers continuing to move across the keyboard, each action deliberate, recorded. The manager remained still, her gaze no longer searching for control, but steady, present, accepting the process as it unfolded. Malcolm's eyes moved across the room once more, not lingering, not judging, simply observing. This was the point where everything became real, where the abstract idea of consequence turned into something tangible, something that could not be undone. The first executive turned back toward him, his tone respectful, measured. "Your transaction will be processed immediately," he said. The words were simple, but they carried a shift that was impossible to ignore. What had been denied moments ago was now being restored without hesitation. Malcolm inclined his head slightly, acknowledging, but not reacting beyond that, because this was never about the transaction itself. It was about everything that had happened before it. The teller began the process, her hands steady now, her focus complete. The screen updated with each step, confirmation after confirmation appearing in sequence. The young employee watched closely, her earlier uncertainty replaced with a quiet understanding of how the system should have worked from the beginning. The guard glanced toward the door briefly, then back again, as if marking the moment in his own way. The manager stood still, her presence now part of the process rather than directing it. The second executive made another note on the tablet, then looked up. "This review will extend beyond this branch," he said. The statement was not directed at anyone specifically, but it filled the room. "Patterns will be evaluated across all locations." The words carried a broader implication, one that reached beyond the walls of the branch, beyond the individuals present. Malcolm heard it. Of course he did. His expression did not change, but there was a slight shift in his eyes, a recognition of the scale of what had just been set in motion. Because this was never about one moment, it was about a system that had been allowed to operate unchecked until now. The teller paused briefly, then spoke. "Transaction confirmed," she said. The words were clear, steady, final. The process that had been denied was now complete. The first executive nodded once, then turned back to Malcolm. "We regret the initial handling of this situation," he said. The apology was formal, but it carried weight because it came after action, not before. Malcolm met his gaze, his voice calm, steady. "Make sure it does not happen again," he said. The words were not harsh, not raised, but they carried more authority than anything else spoken in the room. The executive nodded, understanding fully. "It will not," he replied. The manager lowered her gaze briefly, then lifted it again, her expression no longer defensive, no longer uncertain, but reflective. The teller's hands rested against the counter again, her role in the moment now complete. The young employee exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing as the tension that had built from the beginning finally began to release. The guard remained still, his presence steady, his role unchanged but redefined by what he had witnessed. Malcolm took a small step back, not retreating, not leaving yet, just shifting his position slightly, as if marking the end of one phase and the beginning of another. The room followed the movement without realizing it. The executives remained composed, their work not finished, but clearly defined. The system behind the counter continued to display updates, each line a record of what had been done, what would follow, and in the center of it all, Malcolm Hayes stood exactly as he had from the beginning, calm, composed, unshaken. He had not needed to raise his voice, had not needed to demand recognition, had not needed to explain who he was, because by the time that question mattered, the system had already answered it. And now, as the branch moved forward under a different kind of control, as roles shifted and consequences took form, there was nothing left in the room that resembled the moment that had started it. Only the truth remained, clear, undeniable, and fully in place. The room did not return to normal after the transaction was completed. It redefined what normal meant, because once something is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen, and every person standing there knew that the moment had already extended beyond the walls of the branch. The system behind the counter continued to run, but now it did so under a different kind of awareness. Every action logged, every decision measured, every step aligned with something that had been exposed in real time. The executives remained present, not as authority figures imposing control, but as anchors ensuring that the process would not drift back into what it had been. The first executive reviewed the tablet once more, then spoke, his voice calm, deliberate. "The initial findings will be submitted within the hour," he said. The words were not directed at any one person, but they carried across the room with quiet precision. The manager nodded slightly, her posture now composed in a different way, not rigid, not defensive, but grounded in acceptance. She had moved from reaction to reflection, and it showed in the way she stood, in the way she listened. The teller adjusted her position behind the counter, her hands no longer hovering, no longer uncertain, but resting lightly as if ready to continue, though she knew nothing about this moment. Would continue as it had before. The young employee stepped back toward her station, but she did not turn away, her attention still anchored to Malcolm Hayes, as if understanding that the most important part of this was not what had just been fixed, but what had been revealed. The guard remained near the entrance, his presence steady, his eyes occasionally moving across the room, not scanning for disruption, but absorbing the quiet shift that had taken place. Malcolm stood still, his posture unchanged, his presence as composed as it had been from the beginning. But now there was something else in the way the room responded to him, something quieter, something deeper, recognition not of status, but of clarity. The second executive stepped closer to the counter again, his voice low but clear. "This branch will remain under review until further notice," he said. The statement settled into the room without resistance. There was nothing left to challenge it, nothing left to question. The manager looked at him, then at Malcolm, then back again. "Understood," she said. Her voice was steady, not because she was unaffected, but because she had accepted the weight of what had already happened. Malcolm's gaze moved across the room once more, taking in each person, not as individuals who had made mistakes, but as parts of a system that had just been forced to see itself clearly. He took a small breath, not out of tension, but out of completion. Then he spoke, his voice calm, even, but carrying a quiet finality. "This was not about punishment," he said. The words shifted the room again, because they reframed everything that had just occurred. The manager's eyes lifted slightly. The teller looked up. The young employee leaned forward just a fraction. "It was about exposure," Malcolm continued. A pause. "You cannot fix what you do not see." The phrase settled into the space, simple, direct, undeniable. The first executive nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the clarity. The second executive made a brief note on the tablet, then looked up again. The manager exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just enough to signal that the truth had fully settled. "We see it now," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried sincerity. Malcolm held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once. Not approval, not forgiveness, but recognition of the shift. The teller's hands rested lightly on the counter, her earlier tension replaced with a quiet awareness of how easily things could have been different. The young employee's expression softened, not because the moment had ended, but because it had been understood. The guard remained still, his role unchanged, but his perspective clearly altered. The executive stepped back slightly, not leaving, but allowing the room to exist without their immediate direction, because the most important part of the process had already taken place. Malcolm shifted his weight slightly, then took a step back, creating space, not retreating, but signaling that his role in the moment was complete. The room followed the movement again, not consciously, but instinctively. The manager watched him, her expression steady, reflective. "Will there be further action?" she asked. The question was not defensive, not fearful. It was grounded in understanding. The first executive answered, his voice calm. "There will be recommendations," he said, "and accountability." The words were clear, structured, final. Malcolm listened, then spoke again, his voice carrying the same calm authority. "Make the change visible," he said. A pause. Not just in policy, but in practice. The phrase settled into the room with weight. Because policy had been present from the beginning, and it had not been enough. The manager nodded slowly. The meaning fully understood. The teller glanced at the screen one last time, then back at Malcolm. The young employee straightened, her posture now aligned with something deeper than instruction. The guard shifted slightly, his presence steady. The executives remained composed, their roles continuing beyond this moment. Malcolm turned slightly, not fully away, but enough to signal that he was no longer at the center of the action. He did not rush to leave, did not make a statement of departure. He simply allowed the moment to close around what had already been established, and as he stood there, just a step removed from where everything had begun, the room did not return to what it had been. It could not, because the system had been seen, the pattern had been named, and the truth had been spoken without force, without volume, without anything except clarity. And Malcolm Hayes, who had walked into the branch as someone the room had decided did not belong, now stood as the reason it would never operate the same way again. The room did not rush to move forward. It lingered in the clarity that had been established, as if every person present understood that leaving too quickly would mean losing something important, something that had taken time, pressure, and truth to surface. The system behind the counter continued its quiet operation, but now it carried a different rhythm, one that reflected awareness rather than assumption. The executives stood composed, no longer directing every second, but ensuring that nothing slipped back into what it had been. The manager remained near the counter, her posture steady, her expression thoughtful, as if she was replaying every moment not to defend it, but to understand it fully. The teller adjusted her stance slightly, her hands now resting with purpose, not hesitation, her earlier uncertainty replaced by a clear sense of what should have happened from the beginning. The young employee stood just behind her station, her gaze still anchored to Malcolm Hayes, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of respect for the clarity he had brought into the room. The guard remained near the entrance, his presence unchanged, but his awareness sharpened by what he had witnessed. Malcolm stood quietly, his role in the moment complete, but his presence still shaping the space in a way that did not require words. The first executive glanced at the tablet once more, then spoke, his voice calm, measured. "Preliminary actions will be implemented immediately," he said. The words did not carry urgency, but they carried inevitability. The manager nodded once, her voice steady. Understood. There was no resistance left, only acceptance of what had already begun. The second executive stepped slightly to the side, his gaze moving across the room, taking in each person as if marking their place within the process. "Training protocols will be updated," he said. "Behavioral assessments will be required." The statements were clear, structured, forward-moving. They did not erase what had happened, but they ensured it would not be ignored. The teller listened carefully, her posture straightening slightly, as if aligning herself with the expectation being set. The young employee nodded faintly, her understanding now extending beyond this moment into what would come next. The manager exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing just enough to signal that she was no longer carrying the need to defend, only the responsibility to change. Malcolm's eyes moved once more across the room, not lingering, not judging, simply observing the shift that had taken place. This was the part that mattered, not the exposure itself, but what followed it. He took a small breath, then spoke, his voice calm, even, but carrying quiet authority. "Change is not in the report," he said. The words settled into the room, drawing attention without force. "It is in the next decision you make when no one is watching." The phrase landed deeper than anything procedural could. The manager looked at him, her expression steady, reflective. She nodded slowly. The meaning fully understood. "That is where it failed," she said quietly. The admission did not carry shame. It carried awareness. The teller glanced at Malcolm, then back at the counter, her hands pressing lightly against the surface as if grounding the lesson in something tangible. The young employee's posture shifted, her shoulders straightening, her focus sharpening. The guard remained still, but there was a subtle change in the way he stood, as if he, too, had adjusted something internal. The executives allowed the silence to settle again, not because there was nothing left to say, but because what had been said was enough. The system behind the counter displayed one final update. The review now marked as active, ongoing, irreversible. The first executive turned slightly toward Malcolm, his tone respectful. "We appreciate your patience," he said. The words were formal, but they carried weight because they followed action. Malcolm inclined his head slightly, acknowledging without extending the moment. Because this was not about appreciation, it was about correction. The manager stepped forward just slightly, not to reclaim space, but to meet the moment where it now stood. "This will not be repeated," she said. Her voice was steady, not as a promise to him alone, but as a commitment to the system she was now part of correcting. Malcolm held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once. Not approval, not absolution, but recognition. The teller returned to her position fully, her role ready to continue, but with a different awareness guiding it. The young employee stepped back into place, her posture aligned with something deeper than instruction. The guard remained near the entrance, his presence steady, but now informed by what he had seen. The executives began to shift slightly, not leaving yet, but transitioning into the next phase of their role. Malcolm turned, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with quiet intention, his movement, signaling that his part in the moment had reached its natural end. He took a step toward the exit, not rushed, not hesitant, just steady. The room followed the motion again, not consciously, but instinctively. The manager watched him, her expression thoughtful, grounded. The teller glanced up briefly, then back to her work. The young employee held her gaze on him for a moment longer before returning to her station. The guard straightened slightly, not in preparation, but in acknowledgement. Malcolm reached the door, his hand resting briefly on the handle, the same way it had when he entered, simple, unremarkable, but now carrying a different meaning. He paused for just a second, not to look back, not to make a statement, but to let the moment settle fully into the space he was leaving behind. Then he stepped out, the door closing quietly behind him. Inside, the branch did not return to what it had been. It could not, because what had been revealed could not be undone, and what had been understood could not be ignored. The system continued. The process moved forward, but now it did so with a clarity that had not existed before. And every person in that room, from the manager to the teller to the young employee to the guard, carried something with them that was not written in any report, not logged in any system, but present in every decision they would make next. Outside, the air felt different, not because it had changed, but because Malcolm Hayes had carried something out of that building that could not be contained within it. The glass doors closed behind him with a soft, final sound, sealing the moment inside while the impact moved far beyond it. He stepped onto the sidewalk, the city continuing as it always did, cars passing, people walking, conversations blending into a steady hum that had no idea what had just shifted a few feet away. Malcolm paused for a brief moment, not to reflect in a dramatic way, not to linger in the outcome, but to allow the weight of the moment to settle into something quieter, something internal. He adjusted his sleeves slightly, the same simple motion he had made countless times before, and then he began to walk. Inside the branch, the silence did not disappear when he left. It deepened. The manager stood where she was, her eyes moving toward the door, not following him physically, but acknowledging the space he had occupied. The teller resumed her work, but her movements carried a new precision, not just in process, but in awareness. The young employee returned to her station, her posture aligned with something that had not been there before, a clarity that would shape every interaction that followed. The guard remained near the entrance, his presence steady, but his perspective altered in a way that no training manual could replicate. The executives continued their work, their voices low, their instructions precise, but even within their structure, there was an understanding that what had just occurred would ripple outward in ways no single report could fully capture. The system behind the counter logged its final entries for the moment, each line a record of action, of correction, of consequence. But none of them capturing the most important part, the shift that had taken place in how people saw, how they decided, how they would act next time. The manager finally moved, stepping back toward her office, not to retreat, but to begin the process of reflection that would now be required of her. She paused at the doorway, her hand resting lightly against the frame, her mind replaying the first moment, the first assumption, the first decision that had set everything else in motion. She understood now that nothing about it had been loud, nothing about it had been obvious, and that was exactly why it mattered. The teller glanced up briefly, her eyes following the manager for a second before returning to her screen. The young employee took a small breath, then began assisting the next customer, her tone calm, her process clear, her approach unchanged in structure but transformed in intention. The guard shifted slightly, his gaze moving across the room, not scanning for issues, but observing with a deeper awareness of what could exist beneath the surface of a simple request. Outside, Malcolm continued walking, his pace steady, his expression unchanged, not because the moment had not mattered, but because it had. He had seen it before, felt it before, understood it long before it happened again today. But this time, something had been different. This time, the system had been forced to respond in real time, to reveal itself before it could be explained away. He reached the corner, the city stretching out ahead of him, familiar, constant, indifferent. He did not look back. He did not need to, because the point of the moment was never to be remembered by him. It was to be remembered by those who had been inside it, inside the branch. The first executive closed the review on his tablet for the moment, his voice low as he spoke to his colleague. "This will set a precedent," he said. The second executive nodded once, understanding fully. "It already has," he replied. The words were simple, but they carried weight. The manager sat down at her desk, the quiet of the office surrounding her, the events of the last hour still clear, still present. She opened her system, not to manage operations, but to begin documenting what had happened, not just in terms of actions, but in terms of understanding. The teller continued her work, her focus steady, her process aligned. The young employee moved with quiet confidence. Her earlier hesitation replaced with clarity. The guard remained at his post, his presence unchanged, but his awareness sharpened, and Malcolm Hayes, now just another figure moving through the city, carried nothing visible with him. No sign of what had just occurred, no indication of the authority he held, no need to display anything at all. Because the power in that moment had never been about what he could show, it had been about what he could reveal. And what he had revealed was not just a flaw in a process, not just a mistake in judgment, but a pattern, one that existed quietly, consistently, until it was forced into the light. The story of that moment would not be written in headlines. It would not be spoken loudly. It would not be reduced to a single event. It would live in the next decision, in the next interaction, in the moment when someone stood in front of a counter and was seen not as an assumption, but as a person. And in that way, the moment did not end when Malcolm walked out of the bank. It began there, because true change does not happen when power is revealed. It happens when perception is corrected, and Malcolm Hayes had not needed to raise his voice, had not needed to declare who he was, had not needed to demand anything at all. He had simply stood still, allowed the truth to arrive, and let the system show itself exactly as it was. And in doing so, he had left behind something far more powerful than authority. He had left behind clarity, and clarity, once seen, does not fade. It stays, it shapes, it transforms, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. And somewhere inside that branch, in every decision that would follow, in every moment where someone could choose assumption or awareness, the echo of what had happened would remain, quiet but undeniable. A reminder that dignity does not need to be announced, and justice does not need to be forced. It only needs to be revealed.